this video, we're going to be talking about the kinematic concepts for analyzing human motion. So we're going to learn a little bit about some of the terminology that you need to use, as well as some of the math behind the analysis. Now, first, we're going to talk about some different forms of motion, specifically looking at linear motion. Linear motion is basically moving along in a line. Now, it's not just part of you that's moving in a line, it's the full body moving in that line. So like kicking a soccer ball, for example, if I was standing still and I push my leg back and I kick a soccer ball, my full body's not moving in a linear motion, but my foot would be moving in what we would call a curvilinear motion, because it's actually moving along a curved line. If I were running, okay, now obviously my whole body is moving along as I run, but my arms are swinging and my legs are swinging in a slightly different motion, but my full body would be moving along. All of it is moving along, okay? Now, linear motion is split up into three different directional linear motion. So rectilinear is moving along exactly a straight line. So that would be like doing, say, something like a pull-up. So you pull yourself up to the bar, you pull yourself down. You're moving up, you're moving down, you're moving in a straight line. Curvilinear would be moving along a curved line. So let's say you do like a leap or a jump. You kind of leave off the ground and you kind of follow a curved line as you go up, and then a curved line as you come down again. So that would be curvilinear. And then an angular rotation is that you're moving around a central imaginary line or an axis of rotation. So like swinging on a bar, for example, would be angular rotation. Our next slide here, there's a bunch of terminology that you should be familiar with from anatomy, but just to review and just make sure we're all on the same page here. Okay, so a mechanical system is the body that is being analyzed. So, and it depends on what you're actually looking at. It could be, if all you're looking at, say like the violin player that I had talked about in our first lecture, if I'm just looking at the violin player, the only thing that's moving is the wrist and the arm, right? So that would be the body, right? It's not the entire body, right? If I were analyzing a long jumper, it would be the whole body, or high jumper would be the whole body. If I was analyzing just a golf swing, okay, it would then be mostly the arms, but the trunk rotation as well. So the shoulders and the top part of the body rotation. If I were analyzing something like someone just kicking a ball, okay, maybe not running after it to kick it, just standing and just kick the ball, then it would just be the leg swing, right? So whatever the body is that's being analyzed, that is referred to as the mechanical system. It's that body, that portion of the body, depending on the skill, that we're actually analyzing. Now, whenever you're talking about these analysis using terminology, we should be using our correct terminology, referring to anatomical position. So first of all, the anatomical position is somebody depicted in this picture standing forward with their palms facing forward, feet shoulder width apart, and hands put down and palms facing forward to the front. Okay, that's the anatomical reference position. Now, if we're talking about superior, we're close to the head. Inferior means you're away from the head. Sorry. If we're talking about anterior, it's toward the front of the body. Posterior would be toward the back of the body. If we're talking about medial, it's toward the midline of the body. Lateral is away from the midline of the body. Proximal is closer to the trunk. Distal will be away from the trunk. Superficial is the surface of the body, and deep would be toward the inside of the body, or like away from the surface of the body. Now a little bit more terminology here. So when we're looking at reference axes and planes, there's three main planes that the body's divided into. There's the sagittal plane, which, as you can see in the diagram, is cutting the body between left and the right. And then there's here it's called the horizontal plane in the picture, but usually we refer to it as the transverse plane, which is kind of parallel to the ground and kind of cuts it into a top and a bottom scenario. And then the frontal plane, which you can see in blue here, where it's kind of dividing the body into front and back. Now there's certain movements that lie in each of these planes. So in the sagittal plane, that consists of forward and backward movements. So things like flexion, extension, hypertension, plantar flexion, and dorsiflexion, those occur within the sagittal plane. Now when we're talking about the transverse plane, we're looking at horizontal movements. It is a horizontal plane, yes, but the proper name we use is transverse. But horizontal plane, we're looking at movements like medial and lateral rotation, pronation, supination, horizontal abduction, and adduction. These are movements within the the transverse plane. And then the third plane there, the frontal plane, the movements within there include lateral movements such as abduction, adduction, lateral flexion, eversion and inversion, elevation, depression, ulnar and radial deviation. Now there's one more movement that's called circumduction. And circumduction is a movement that occurs in more than one plane. Okay, so you're moving across different planes, maybe a combination of frontal and horizontal or other such examples. Now on your textbook, page 35 to 39, it goes through and summarizes these examples of movements that exist within these planes. If you want to read a little bit more detail about that, you can refer to your textbook there. Now, we've talked already about the difference between qualitative analysis versus quantitative analysis, at least an introduction to it. Now, we're going to focus a little bit more on qualitative analysis in this lecture here. So, qualitative analysis is always based on a visual observation, and it requires knowledge about that specific purpose of the movement, and you need to have the ability to detect the causes of errors within the movement, which means you have to kind of know what the movement is, what it should look like, and how it should be properly executed. Okay, so again, remember that qualitative refers to like form and function and technique, right? So you have to have some knowledge about this. Now, there are different ways of gaining knowledge. You can, obviously, if you've participated in the sport and you've learned how to do the skill from other skillful people or coaches, you will have learned a little bit about it. You could also learn from like research articles and different researchers what they've found to be the perfectly executed skill and the technique behind it. So reading different books by skillful individuals, being mentored, I suppose, which is kind of similar to being coached, but just kind of learning what the proper technique is for certain skills. You have to know that technique in order to be able to analyze somebody else's technique, and look at it qualitatively. Okay. Now, it's always also good to know what are the common errors that occur and know how to fix those errors. So watching for those errors, and those come from experience and knowledge about the actual skill itself. When we're participating in a qualitative analysis session, we do have to plan ahead a little bit. We have to think ahead. And the biggest thing we need to know going into the session is what is the purpose of this analysis? Now, as a coach, you might be looking at their technique and making sure that they have proper technique and good execution of the technique. As a physiotherapist, you might be looking at more as an angle of, okay, this person is injured. What is the cause of this injury and how can we fix it so that the injury can heal and so it doesn't keep happening? So different perspectives on this analysis. So first of all, you have to figure out what is the question to be answered. Am I looking for a problem in their execution of a skill that is now leading to an injury happening? Or am I looking at, okay, they're not really doing this skill very well. How could they be doing it better so that they're more successful? And so looking at their form and technique. Now, depending on what the question to be answered is, it may be better to view from different perspectives. Okay, you might want to be looking from the top down or from the bottom up or from the side or from the back or from the front, depending on what part of a skill you're actually looking at. your perspective would definitely influence what you're observing. Also, how far away you are. Okay, some skills you want to be really, really close up so you can see one tiny little aspect of the skill. And some skills it's a little bit better to take a few steps and be a little bit back so that you can see the big picture of the skill. Okay, so where do you want to look at the skill to be able to view it properly, or to be able to answer the question you're looking for? And then another thing you want to think about is how many times should I have them perform this movement, and observe, like, are things like fatigue going to affect their ability to perform the skill, or do I need to let them warm up a little bit so that when they perform the skill, their body is loose and free and ready? So thinking about those things as well, depending on what skill you're looking at, you may want to look at it after a few attempts, or you may want to look at the first one or two so that you don't start getting poor form because of fatigue setting in. Other factors that you need to think about when you're doing a qualitative analysis of a skill is the clothing. What is the person wearing? Is it clothing that allows them to move freely, or is it going to restrict their movement? You need to think about, are you going to be able to see what you want to see? The angles that you maybe need to look at. If they're wearing big baggy clothing, it's hard to see specific portions of movement if that's what you're looking for, right? The other thing you want to think about is the surrounding environment. Making sure there's no hazards around, obviously, would be a big factor there. Also making sure that the equipment that they need is there and ready for them. Those are kind of obvious ones. But also thinking about things like, is the temperature going to affect their ability to perform this skill? If it's an outdoor skill, is the sun in their eyes going to affect their ability? Or the wind? Here in Lethbridge, the wind, right? You have to think about the external environment and how that might influence their ability to perform the skill. Also, you need to think about kind of their emotional well-being as well. Are they performing the skill as, are they going to be nervous as they perform? And if they're nervous, are they going to perform it to their best or to their normal ability? Or do they feel comfortable? If they feel comfortable, they're more likely to do what they normally do. If they're feeling kind of judged and watched and maybe the pressure is on, some people perform really well under pressure. Others just kind of buckle and fall when there's pressure there. So think about those things as well. And then the final one is it good enough to just watch it with your eyes? Or do you think you might need to use a video to capture the skill so you can review it either slower or review it multiple times just to see different aspects of the skill? I know, like with my daughter, I've told you before, she does gymnastics. And so lots of times I'll video her doing a skill and I'll show her, okay, see, you think that your legs are here, but really they're not. So this is where they are. And seeing in the video, so seeing that feedback, it helps her to realize, oh, wait, my body wasn't the way I thought it was, right? But even, I mean, that's good for her as an athlete to be more self-aware. But as a coach, if I were watching her skills, it would be helpful to have it on video so I often do. I slow it down a little bit and see, oh, okay, yep, see, just right there, you didn't quite have your legs in the right position. And so that's why it happened the way it did, right? So having that video feedback to be able to play back and look at it again is often really helpful. But sometimes that video can become kind of too much. And so just watching it with just your eyes sometimes is better. So depending on what skill you're looking at, depending on how quickly the skill is executed and how much you'll catch versus how much you'll miss, will kind of determine what kind of tools, I guess, you would want to use in that analysis. So these are just some of the factors to think about when you're planning ahead before you look at a qualitative analysis of any skill. At this point, I just want you guys to just pause and just think to yourself for a minute and try and answer these questions. What would be an example of a movement or a skill that would best be observed under these three conditions? Close up, 2 to 3 meters away, and from far away. Okay, so what kind of skill would be best to be performed in each of these conditions? Have a think about that for a minute. And maybe even pause the video and answer those questions to yourselves and see what you think. Okay, what skills would be best to observe from a side view? From the front, from the back, or from the top? So again, try and answer these questions to yourself. Maybe pause the video and try and answer these questions to yourself as well. Now, again, when you're doing a qualitative analysis, you've got to think about different factors that will affect the performance of a skill. Now, age is the first factor we're going to talk about quickly. So you have to think about the age of the person you're observing as to how they're going to execute that skill versus the expectation of level of expertise of the skill as well. We're probably not going to be looking much at infants, but infant versus elementary school age versus teenager, young adult, or older adult, they're all going to have a different expectation in the way they would execute a skill, based on their growth, based on their size, based on their abilities. Obviously, an older adult is probably not going to be expected to be performing certain skills that maybe like a teenager or young adult might be able to. Even elementary school age versus a teenager, they're going to be executing their skills in a very different way just because of the proportions of their body and their sizes of their bodies. Gender also plays a role. And I don't even know, gender is definitely a factor, but even more so, anthropometry is even a bigger factor. So your body segmentation, the body shape that you have is going to affect the way you perform a skill. A long, slender body as opposed to a shorter, stout body, they're going to execute skills a little bit differently, and they're going to perform the skills a little bit differently. And so you have to take those into account as well as you are observing these skills being executed. Developmental levels. So again, that kind of comes back to a little bit to do with age and anthropometry, but also in terms of, are they a beginner versus are they a novice versus are they an expert? How well do you think they should be able to perform that skill? You're not going to take someone who's a beginner and fine tune and polish their skill to the level that a professional would have, right? You kind of set your expectations. Now, I'm not saying don't expect anything out of them, but you change your level of expectation and expertise of the skill according to what development level they are at within that particular sport. So someone just learning to dribble a basketball is not going to be the same as someone who's been dribbling a basketball for 5 or 10 years of their lives, right? Or shooting a basketball or kicking a soccer ball. It's just not going to be the same. You would not instruct a beginner the same way that you would instruct an expert within any skill. Other traits that would impact their performance, you have to think about those as well. So things like their strength, how strong they are versus their weaknesses, obviously. How flexible they are. Like, I know for me, I'm not the most flexible person on the earth. I know my children are much more flexible than I, but even amongst my children, like my daughter is super flexible. She's been doing gymnastics, so that helps. My sons have started gymnastics. My second born, he is quite flexible when it comes to his like trying splits and stuff. But when you try and get him to do anything in like the pike position, he can barely move, right? And then my youngest, he's got these amazing toes. Like, he can point his toes to the point where he's on the ground with his front toe touches the ground as he's pointing it, but he can't, like, you put him into any kind of split and he looks like he's almost standing straight up. So flexibility, but flexibility even within segments of the body, segmental flexibility, all those things are going to affect their performance as well as coordination, how, I guess, comfortable they are within their own bodies. Personality traits will also affect their performance. If they're more outgoing, they're going to be more aggressive within the skill versus more reserved. They're going to be a little bit like shy and reserved. They're going to hold back a little bit and may not like give everything to the skill, and that's going to affect how they perform it as well as their emotional state. Now, I talked about this a little bit on the other slide, but like if they're super nervous, like if you're going to judge their ability to perform a skill, do you want to judge it in terms of during a practice session, during a warm-up, during a competition where all the pressure is there? just thinking about their emotional state. Are they really stressed out? Are they distracted? Do they have a lot going on in their personal lives that's going to detract from their ability to perform skills the way they typically would, right? So I think just taking those things into a factor as well, because those things will affect their performance. Now on this slide, I just have the tools that we use to measure kinematics. We use video. Video is very frequently used within biomechanics. You video a skill and then you analyze it afterwards. And then I did talk already in our first class about motion capture, and that's what I did for my master's project. And these pictures actually come from my master's project. If you look at the first picture here, this top one up here, this shows like the lab setup of what my master's project was. So this was my master's project lab setup. So the bike was in the middle of the room, and then around the room I had all these motion capture cameras. Now they don't capture a digital image. They send off little infrared lights that are reflected on little balls that are placed at certain anatomical positions on the body of a person. So this is an example of one of my subjects who participated in my pre-study. This wasn't actually my real study. He was not in my real study. He was in my pre-study. But so I dressed my subjects up in this little suit, that it's a Velcro suit, and I can Velcro these little points, these little balls on the exact anatomical position. And then so we calibrate the machine. The whole system gets calibrated by the person kind of standing out there, just in not the anatomical position, but with arms spread out, legs spread out, so that all of the points can be visualized, and then they can mount the bike and they can ride the bike. And all of these cameras all around, I don't know if you can see, there's a couple of cameras here, you can see the red lights there. That's the lights that's being reflected off of these little reflections, which creates the digital image that comes out. And by digital image, it's not like a picture, it's a digital image of like stick figures, and we saw an image of that before. But so motion capture. Video is often used because it's simple and it's cheap. A system like this is very expensive and it's very complicated, but it does give you more exact data. Before I did my actual master's project, I did a capstone project, which is kind of a pre-master's project, where I analyzed swim form, and on the front crawl, where we're looking at angle of the arm, like the angle that the arm reaches into the water, and through the pull within the swim stroke, the front crawl swim stroke. And I just used basic video for that. I just took a video camera and I videoed people swimming, and then I analyzed it on a program afterwards where I could actually draw in the angles. Like I could pause it on a frame, draw in the angle, measure the angle. So you don't need the fancy motion capture system, although it's really cool and it's really neat. All it really does is it does give you the angles of the joints because of the stick figure that's produced afterwards, but it doesn't give you any kinematic information in terms of it doesn't give us any feedback about forces and about any of those things. We have to have other external things to measure those things as well. But video works just fine. It's maybe not as seamless, but it is a lot cheaper and a lot more practical in most settings, because you would need a massive room. Like this room, we barely could fit everything in there. It's a huge room. We could barely fit the system setup in there. And for one of our studies, I actually went up to Edmonton, up to the U of A campus, and we were doing some motion capturing on the U of A campus, and the room that they gave us was not big enough. We had to get a different room because the room they gave us wasn't big enough to set up our system in there. So it takes a lot of space, and obviously you wouldn't be able to capture in just anything in this space. You would have to have the right kind of sport or the right kind of skill to analyze within this motion capture system. Okay, for this chapter, we're not going to be doing any specific question from the textbook. Instead, we're going to do an assignment that's a qualitative description of a skill. You can find details about that assignment on Canvas. So please refer to Canvas for the information regarding this assignment specifics.